In this video, we're installing 456 gears to better match the larger off-road tires our friend Andrew is running in his Tahoe, and for better traction, a rear locker. As you can see, he's been having trouble with losing traction in off-camber situations, and a locker is the perfect solution to this problem. Now, he did eventually make it up this obstacle with plenty of skinny pedal, but that comes with some trade-offs.
Oh no! Yeah. Yeah.
That's something worse.
It sounded like a CV. That sounded like a CV.
What was that? I think I sent a little too fucking hard, bud.
Oh boy.
It sounded good though.
Let's get this thing into the shop so we can get to work making this Tahoe more capable off-road. Alright, well, we've ran into our first issue. Going through the parts here to make sure we have everything we need. And for the front, we have the 8 1/4 456 gear ring and pinion for the front axle. Master install kit. Looks like everything's there. Rear locker, that looks good. Master install kit for the rear, 8 1/2. Got the crush sleeve eliminator, and then opened up the package for the ring and pinion for the rear. This is supposed to be an 8 1/2, which is slightly bigger than the front, but the hell is that? It's freaking tiny. Won't even fit over that. I don't know what the heck this thing is, but it is not the right one. We ordered the right gears. That's what was in it. Anyway, I was going to start on the rear, but obviously that's not going to happen until we get a new ring and pinion. So let's get started on the front. Now we're not going to have to pull the front IFS out of this because he's got another one sitting right here that we're going to do the gearing on. The reason is he broke the one that's in this truck. Broke it but good. So we're going to do the gearing in this axle, and then he'll swap this in later. That's certainly a lot easier than dealing with a Dana 60, I'll tell you that. The first step is to drain the differential, then we remove the four-wheel drive actuator. Next up, remove the passenger side axle extension. With the extension out of the way, we can remove the bolts holding the case halves together, then split the case to expose the ring gear and carrier. With just a couple of taps on the driver's side axle shaft, the carrier drops free. With the carrier removed, we remove the pinion yoke, then gently tap the pinion out of the case half. Next, we remove the side adjusters from the case halves. These adjustable spacers are similar to what's in a 14-bolt rear axle, and are used to set the ring gear position, which controls the backlash. I spent a little time trying to bend back the tabs that keep the adjusters from spinning, before realizing I could just push the whole assembly through with a brass punch. With the case halves disassembled, we got to work on the passenger side axle extension. Taking this apart isn't strictly necessary in order to re-gear the front end, but while we have everything this far apart, we might as well replace all the seals and completely rebuild the front end. After removing the spring and actuator fork, I was able to pry the axle end off of its bearing. The axle gear on the end of the axle extension is held on by an internal snap ring. A couple of good taps with a brass hammer, and the axle drops free of the gear. There's a little snap ring in there. It's evidently around there, but I had to pop that off. Once we removed the seals from the extension, we pulled the ring gear and bearings from the carrier, and the front diff was fully disassembled. Okay, we've got the case all broken down, got everything cleaned up and looking good. So now it's time to reassemble this. We've got our master install kit and put all fresh parts in this and get our new gears installed. A couple quick things to note. The ring gear bolts on this thing are actually reverse thread, so be careful when you're taking the ring gear off the carrier. And another thing, this axle uses side adjusters. So we're not going to be using spacers to dial in the carrier. So that should make life a little easier. Let's get it put together. Now we're ready to set up our pinion. This is the old pinion, and the pinion depth is set by the spacers that go underneath the lower pinion bearing that was pressed down on there. Well, we pulled these off, and now we're ready to use our new pinion and set up the spacers. But we don't want to have to press this bearing on and off multiple times while we're trying to get this the spacer stack set correctly. Here's our new spacers, by the way. So what we're going to do is we're going to ream this out so that it fits on there loose enough so we can take it on and off easily. Then once we've got our pinion depth set, we'll remove the old bearings and we'll press on the new bearings. Now, in order to ream these out, it's going to take a carbide bit. This metal is extremely hard. A regular bit just isn't going to do it. Carbide bit. So let's get these reamed out so that we can finish setting up our pinion. All right, we've got our setup bearings on the pinion and the pinion reinstalled without the crush sleeve. We just need to get it set so that we can set up the backlash on the carrier for now. So we put it in there without the crush sleeve and then just tighten it up to where it would just turn a bit without binding, close enough so we can set it up. Now, you put the carrier in and then you put the two case halves together, and then you adjust where the carrier sits with these adjustment rings. Now, you want to be careful that when you screw this back together with the carrier in, that these adjusters are not in too tight because you could crack the case. So be real careful with that. But once the carrier is in place and you need to make your adjustments, well, you need a special tool to do that. Now, I took a look online to see if I could buy that tool, and the cheapest one I saw was $132. Not going to happen. So we're going to make our own tool. Check this out. What I did is I pulled the adjusters out, flipped it over so that these teeth could make an imprint on a piece of paper or cardboard so I could see exactly where these teeth were. Then I transferred that to steel, drilled some holes, and bammo. Some 1/4-inch bolts, welded on, and then I welded on this extension so I could use a ratchet if I need to. And ta-da! The world's ugliest, but hopefully effective adjuster tool. So I'll put that in place. I don't know if you can see that. Maybe, let me see if I can put that. And there we go. We can make our adjustments. Now that we've got our tool, let's get the case put together and start adjusting the backlash on the carrier. Again, it's important to go slow putting the case together in case you have the adjusters in too tight. It may look like I'm just slamming the bolts home, but I've actually had the case together a few times at this point, and I'm getting the bolts barely tight for now. Because this is a closed case, you have to remove the inspection cover in order to access the ring gear when it's installed. This is the only way to check your pattern when setting pinion depth. The closed case also means that you have to set backlash measured off of the pinion yoke rather than off the ring gear directly. We strapped the diff down to the table to keep it from moving, and once we had the backlash set correctly, we bent the retaining tabs back over the adjusters, then we were ready to move on to setting pinion depth. It took several iterations of pulling everything apart, cleaning off the gears, adding or removing shims, then putting it all back together again before we were able to get a good pattern. But with a good pattern finally done, it was time to install the crush sleeve and get the pinion torque set. Got it. Now that we have the backlash, pinion depth, and pinion torque all set correctly, we're good to button up this case for the last time. Tighten all the bolts to the correct torque, replace the rest of the gaskets, and top it off with fluid. All right, that's it for the front axle. Now it's time to get to work on the back. Now, it's certainly doable to rebuild an axle while it's still installed in the vehicle, but after doing a lot of axles, we've come to the conclusion that whenever possible, it's worth the extra time to completely remove it from the vehicle. Having full access while it's sitting on an axle cart is so much nicer than trying to wrestle gear sets over your head while under a vehicle. In the long run, you end up saving a lot of time and effort. When tearing apart the axle, I mark the bearing caps to be sure that I don't mix them up when reinstalling. Next up is removing the retaining bolts that hold the center pin in place. With the pin removed, we can slide the axles in slightly and then remove the C-clips. There's the C-clips. With the C-clips out of the way, we can slide the axles out and then remove the ring gear and pinion. All right, we've got the differential completely torn down, cleaned up as good as we can. And here is the old gear set. This Gov Lock, Gov Bomb, whatever you want to call it. Normally, we'd be breaking this down to install our new gears. But he's not going to be using this. This is his new locker from Yukon. Now, so this is a carrier replace locker. So we're going to be installing the new gears onto this carrier. So we just cleaned this one up. He wants to keep it. Maybe he could sell this to somebody, use it for something else. But we don't need to worry about this carrier at all. And we don't even need to pull the bearings off it because this carrier uses external spacers to set the backlash. So the spacers fit on top like that instead of going underneath the bearing races or underneath the bearings. But we do need to break down the pinion because we're going to need to make setup bearings out of these bearings because we need to set the pinion depth with shims that are underneath here. And oops. We're also, oh boy. There's the crush sleeve. We're using a crush sleeve eliminator kit this time. Right here. So instead of having a crush sleeve that will crush down to set your height, we have this eliminator that will fit on there, and then your bearing preload is set by these shims. So That way we can get this all set, and then we can take the carrier in and out as many times, we can take the pinion in and out as many times as we need to and not have to worry about torquing the pinion nut every time, because our preload is going to be set by these guys. So anyway, let's get this broken down, create our setup bearings, and get everything assembled, and then we can start running patterns. Okay, little update. We have been having a hell of a time getting the gears set up in this Chevy 8.5. And initially we thought the problem was that we had the wrong ring gear and pinion. When we first started having issues, we pulled everything out to give it a good once over, and we noticed that we had we had bought Yukon gears. It came in a Yukon box, but the gears were not Yukon gears. So we're like, aha, we've got the wrong gears. It didn't fit. The pinion was actually, it felt like it was hitting the ring gear. So we swapped it out. We got some gears from a local vendor here in Salt Lake. We got the ring and pinion in a Yukon box. With the part numbers are right on the ring and pinion, so we know for sure these are Yukon gears. Put it all back together, still had the same problem. Like, what the heck is going on? This is a Yukon locker. These are Yukon gears. Everything should go together, and it wasn't. So I start messing with it, try and figure out what's going on, and I noticed there were some marks on the carrier here, on the locker. And it wasn't the ring gear that was hitting the pinion, it was actually the locker, which didn't make any sense at all. So the pinion is actually contacting the locker, which means the pinion is way too deep. But the problem is, I didn't even have any spacers in. Well, decided to pull it all apart, pull everything out, and try and figure out what the heck is going on. And it turns out the problem was actually the bearings. So obviously, when you're changing out a ring and pinion, you get the master install kit, you get all new bearings and races to put in. So I put in the new race, but because we wanted to use setup bearings, I'm using the old bearing to get set up, because I made this so it slips on and off real easy, so I don't have to press it on and off every time. Well, this bearing is significantly different than this bearing. If we use the new race with this old bearing, it only goes about halfway in, which is why the pinion was held out that far and was contacting our carrier. So when you're doing an axle setup, you got to make sure that your bearing and races match up, or you could run into a problem like this. So we're going to use the old race and old bearing together to get set up, and then when we get it close enough, we'll put on the new bearing with the new race, and then double check, make sure we're good. Let's get this thing set up. All right. Okay, we've got our backlash set, our pinion preload set, our pinion depth set, and got a good pattern. So now all we got to do is just put on the real bearings on our pinion. Normally this is pretty straightforward, and it's nothing really changes, but you want to check anyway. This time there might be a change. The fact that we're going to have to change out the pinion bearing and race to a whole different setup means there might be quite a significant change. Hopefully that's not the case, but there's only one way to find out, and we got to put the new bearings on before we get going, because these bearings are a little loose. Luckily, we didn't run into any more problems once we installed the new bearings, so it was time to reassemble the axle and get it installed back on the Tahoe. With the number of times we ended up installing and removing the gear set, I am so happy that we removed the axles from the truck. It can be tempting to try and skip what seemed like unnecessary steps. But once again, having the axle on the stand saved us a whole lot of heartache, and was well worth the time it takes to reinstall the axle. Besides, it also gave us a chance to inspect everything connected to the axle, and we ended up finding a brake line that was about ready to let go. We replaced both rear hard lines before getting this Tahoe back on its wheels. All right, well, we got everything packed up. Got the diff all full of fluid. The front diff is still sitting right here, and Andrew's going to install that later. But rear's ready to go. Let's test drive it, see how she does. All right, we got the Tahoe back here at the shop after doing the test drive, and the gears sound great. So we're ready to hand this thing back off to Andrew. Now, improved 0 to 60 times is not really what he's after, but it does give you a nice seat of the pants feeling for what it's like to have lower gears. I can't wait to see how this thing performs off-road with the lower gears and the locker. So be sure to check out the next Utah Gambler event where you're likely to see this Tahoe doing its thing. Anyway, please subscribe to the channel. That'll really help us out. And thanks for watching You Want a Garage.